I'm Sarah Maslin Nir of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we'll ask what it means when Americans have to leave the country to feel middle class, and when the real luxury is being able to come home. But first, New York City is back in court over homelessness after East Village neighbors sued to stop Mayor Mamdani from opening a new shelter there after closing the 30th Street men's shelter near Bellevue. A state judge has temporarily blocked the move, leaving the administration squeezed between neighbors who don't want a shelter on their street and advocates who say the new site isn't accessible enough for the people it's supposed to serve. New York Times Metro reporter Elizabeth Harris joins me to explain what this standoff reveals about how the city treats its most vulnerable residents. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a big pickle, and you've had the rare experience of actually having gone inside that crumbling, decrepit 30th Street men's shelter. Walk us through. What did you experience there?
Totally. So the 30th Street men's shelter was the largest homeless shelter in the city. It had 850 beds, this enormous facility. And the building takes up a full city block on 30th Street and First Avenue, on that sort of row where all the hospitals are, like NYU and the VA. And it was originally built as the Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. So it's this big, old, institutional feeling place. Like you walk in to kind of the places where the men stay, and it feels like the psych hospital it used to be. Like it feels like a locked place. And no one likes this place. People don't like to stay there. It's big. Big shelters have a lot of problems. Like, you know, there's just a lot of need in one place, and people sleep in rooms with, you know, 12 people to a room, right? So you have 12 people in a really difficult spot sleeping with strangers.
Like barrack style.
Yeah, they're all in these sort of cots in rooms. And so it's not a beloved place, to put it mildly. But also, it's really falling apart. And so the Mamdani administration announced last month that they were going to close it because the building is completely derelict. And while there isn't an immediate danger, there are long-term safety concerns, and it's not fit. It's not fit for people. And I had a tour of it this week, and you know, it's really incredible. So it's this huge building, and there are some spaces that are still used, but most of the building has been abandoned in the Mrs. Havisham sense of the word. Like it was built as this sort of palace almost. Like it was all this money thrown at this building when it was built in the 1930s, and it had like a solarium and an auditorium. The auditorium now has been colonized by pigeons that come and go through this broken window, and there's like chunks of the ceiling are gone, and like parts of the walls have crumbled off. Like, it's incredible. And there is this solarium, which is a room that's filled with light. And, you know, my understanding, and I could be a little off on this, but in the early 20th century, a lot of psychiatry was about sort of giving people light and air and that sort of thing, right? And so there's this solarium with just windows everywhere, and just, it looks like a bomb has gone off in there. Like, it's remarkable. And there's like, it's kind of used as like storage maybe for stuff that's going to get thrown away. But again, like the walls are like not just peeling, like the plaster is gone, and like the roof is gone. And like there's just sort of this shell on the top. And you know, it's really crazy. I've like never been in a space like that was still standing. And they took us to the cellar and the basement and showed a photographer and I this, you know, these pillars that were so corroded, like structural pillars, they looked like they'd been dipped in acid. Like they were like holes in them. And you know, they've done things to shore it up. Like there are these sort of structural supports that they've put in, and they'd be like, look there, where you can see the ceiling going like this. And there would be kind of stuff holding it up around it. But really, like, you know, you're walking up and down the stairs, and it's like, oh, why does the stairs look like that? Oh, it's because they had come apart. And things are, you know, and you can see there's so much water damage in the building. You can see like water bubbling through the walls. You know, like the paint looks like, and it's from like steam. The like steam pipe system is all messed up and is way past its useful life. So there's just everywhere you look, there's signs of like incredible disrepair.
So you had a firsthand account of this, really a remarkable one. We are not structural engineers. We can't speak to the mayor's claims, but one of the claims being made is that this place had to close in an emergent way immediately. And that seems to be part of the lawsuit against closing it or against this new intake shelter is it's not really an emergency.
Yeah, so they're saying he's using emergency powers for something that's not an emergency, and this building has been decaying for decades. And it's true, this building has been decaying for decades. There was actually a lawsuit in the early 80s when Bellevue still had psychiatric patients there, and somebody sued on behalf of the patients saying the building was like a fire trap with poor ventilation and very outmoded. And that was 40 years ago. And you know, they have not put a lot of money into maintaining this building that was used for homeless people. And it's just been kind of crumbling ever since. So as you say, I'm not an engineer. I don't know, but it does feel, you know, there was an engineering report that the city received earlier this year that basically said the building it should be torn down. Like, it's too far gone. And detailed just like incredible deficiencies. I mean, like, there's even like, if you can walk past the building from the outside, you see there are these nets on the cornices. Cornices are those sort of like decorative things at the top of the building. And there are nets on them to keep them from falling onto the sidewalk.
All right,
so
not
it's
great.
not great. It's really not great. I mean, they've done things to make it safe for the moment, but it is not in good shape.
And are my numbers correct that it houses at any point 800 something men? Or?
It was 850 people. All the people who are staying there are gone. So it has two functions. One is as a shelter, and it's a large shelter for men. And the other is it's an intake center, which means people go there when they need a shelter bed. And so you go there and you say, I need a bed, and they say, okay, you'll stay here for a few days, and then you're going to the Brooklyn, you're going to the Bronx, you're going wherever. So it's sort of an assignment place. And the lawsuit is actually about that function, because there actually already is a shelter in that spot in the East Village. It's been there for a long time, but what is the difference is this will be an intake facility. And so there's a lot more churn because new people show up every day, and it's just sort of a constant influx of new people.
I covered homelessness before you, actually, and it was a super interesting and sort of devastating beat because the math doesn't math in New York for a lot of people. And one of the things we're going to talk about later in the show are about people who go abroad, have the luxury to go abroad in order to earn less and live well. I think one of the statistics is New Yorkers spend 30% of their income on rent, and in Manhattan it might even be 50% for some people, or sorry, a large proportion of people are rent overburdened. But homelessness is another matter entirely. Some people are completely precluded from renting apartments. I did a story on this hidden homelessness, which is people tripling up, quadrupling up, sextupling up in apartments, right? Those people technically don't have a place to stay, but they have a roof over their head because they're with neighbors. Can you speak to the persistence of homelessness in the city? I mean, what's happening here?
Well, I mean, one thing that I learned in sort of reporting this story was about sort of the origins of the homelessness, and it's been a problem really since the 70s, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And when it started, there was a combination of one thing that people talk about a lot is psychiatric facilities that used to like warehouse people for years and years were emptied out, and the idea was that people could be cared for close to home with support, but those supports never materialized. People were just sort of dumped on the street. And at the same time, SROs, which were single room occupancy, so you could just rent like a room, started to be shut down and turned into more lucrative things like apartments or hotels. The cheapest housing stock in the city disappeared at the same time that the state and federal government was sort of pulling back support. So all of these things kind of happen at once, but fundamentally it's about housing. It's about cheap apartments not being a thing that people could have anymore, and that's where it began, and it's just an extension of the same problem.
So during my stint about 6 months ago as the homelessness reporter, there was quite seismic shifts from the Trump administration, from federal funding for these things. For example, the Trump administration said they were no longer going to fund long-term solutions, long-term housing, because they want in favor of shelters that move people along, that are transitional would be the description. And there is a tremendous amount, actually in the area of the Bellevue Center, people who've been living 20, 30 years in shelters. And I interviewed them and they said, without this subsidized housing, because at that point, is it really a shelter? If you've been there 20 years, it's very low cost, they would be on the street. And it's interesting that you're talking about something that happened in the 70s, and maybe we're here again with the pullback in funding from these different programs. The mayor has to thread a needle here between lots of different constituencies. and also between vulnerable people in need. What are the arguments on both sides of this shelter, no shelter, closure? Speak to me from both perspectives, if you could.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing to sort of think about is like this giant shelter has been there for so long, in part because it's very hard to open shelters, right? And this place was there, and it was big, and it was also centrally located. Apparently, a lot of homeless folks in this city and in all cities kind of gravitate towards commercial centers because it's sort of a place to stay. Like you can sort of sleep in, a shop is closed down, you can kind of sleep in front overnight, like things like that. People aren't home. Like if you're in a residential area, it's harder to kind of find a place.
Oh, interesting.
So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's sort of being kind of in Midtown is really important. And advocates for folks experiencing homelessness felt that was really important. Like you need an intake center in Manhattan, you need an intake center that's centrally located. They wanted to make sure it wasn't too far away, and also because the one that's there now, or the 30th Street shelter, has been there for 40 years. So everybody, kind of everybody knew, right?
Yeah.
And like men knew that if they needed a bed, that's where you go. And getting the word out among that community is really difficult. So there's that. That's sort of an important piece of it as well. And the city has said they're actually going to maintain a presence on that site even when the building is closed for about a year, so that when people kind of inevitably wander in looking for help and don't know where to go, they will then be like bused to the new site. So everyone knows that everyone in the community knows that these bigger sites are problematic, as I discussed earlier, right? But when you open smaller shelters, you need more of them,
yeah,
right? And people, like in this lawsuit, people are concerned about, like there already is a shelter on that site. It's a substance abuse shelter, but people do tend to stay for a while. Like it's to sort of, help people get stabilized and hopefully move on to supportive housing of some kind. But this new shelter, people will stay for probably 24 hours most of the time, like maybe a day or two.
That's a lot of neighborhood churn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so people are concerned about sort of people who show up who aren't invested in the neighborhood. People show up in crisis, a lot of people, and it's just a lot of churn. So I think that really concerns people. And then some of the people mentioned to me that they have a good relationship with the provider who operates the shelter now. It's it's a nonprofit provider. They operate shelters and transitional housing all over the city. And they have a good relationship with them. If they have a problem, they call them, and they're worried that like calling the Department of Homeless Services, for example, will not be as efficient, right? Big city government, it can be harder to get answers quickly. So that's a concern. But the Mamdani administration, feels that the building is not safe in the long term. Maybe it's not safe now. And they, people need to be in a place that's just more dignified and safer and will actually help people stabilize, as opposed to these places where there's like drugs and violence. Like big places really have a lot of issues. And the Mamdani administration is also trying to move towards kind of purpose-built sites, which means sites that are built to be shelters.
Got it, instead of just repurposing.
Yeah, because there's a lot of this stuff in old hospitals, old armories all around the city. Have since the 80s have been shelters. There's one in Washington Heights. There's this huge armory on Washington Avenue that used to have 1,000 cots in one room.
Oof.
That's not a recipe for anything good. And so it's been this incredibly slow process trying to move away from that. And the city still uses armories as shelters, but trying to kind of this really grueling process to kind of remake the infrastructure.
And it's such an interesting tension, right? That we have this housing shortage on every level. We have a potential solution, and then there's a sort of NIMBYism wherever you try to put a homeless shelter. So I think Mamdani's going to have a pretty challenging time getting through these big agendas to make New York City more affordable, not just for the layperson, the regular person, but also for people experiencing homelessness.
Well, it's very true. I mean, anywhere you want to put a shelter is very challenging. Men's shelters are especially challenging. Family shelters, mean sort of parents and kids, or something like that. There are kids involved, and so that's neighborhoods tend to be more accepting of that. You know, like people are like, oh, kids in need, okay, we will help them, right? And like it's, you know, they sort of assume it's going to be a little calmer, you know, that sort of thing. But single men, shelters for single men, which is what this is the hardest sell in any neighborhood.
Wow. Well, I look forward to you covering more of the developments. I'm sure it'll keep going through the courts, and hopefully there's a solution out there. Thank you, Liz, for your reporting and for joining us today. Coming up, Americans abroad who say coming home simply costs too much. New Yorkers know better than anyone how hard this city has become to afford, from rent to groceries to healthcare. This week, London-based journalist Will McCurdy asked what happens when Americans who already moved overseas for a more affordable life try to come back home and live a life that now feels out of reach. His New York Times article struck a chord, drawing nearly 1,400 comments. Mike Dang from the business desk and the editor behind the piece joins me to talk about what the trade-offs of living abroad really look like and the realities of chasing affordability. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
So this is a treat because we don't often get the editor behind a story, and this was your concept. How did you think up this idea to write about expats wanting to come home and sort of the fear and maybe failure of having your money stretch in America?
Right. So there were a lot of data coming out, especially with the new administration, about a record number of Americans leaving the U.S. Oftentimes it was because of affordability and costs. Some of it is political related, but my question was, were the Americans wanting to leave permanently or did they want to come back eventually? And if they did want to come back eventually, what were the challenges of coming back in terms of cost? So Will McCurdy, he was a journalist based in London. He's also an expat in some ways. He travels the world and you know, writes stories, and that's how he earns his living as a freelance writer. I asked him if he can talk to, you know, American expats from around the world and how they're making it work and what their biggest challenges are. And the two biggest things for American expats were saving for retirement and also the high cost of American healthcare if they were to return.
I love that the journalist himself was living this experience. Yes. That's fascinating. One of the things that was really interesting to me, and I experienced this when I was temporarily in West Africa as the bureau chief for the Times, you can live a really cushy life on a salary that would be kind of penny pinching in America. When I was in Senegal, like one of the people in the story, I took taxis everywhere. Right. I had a housekeeper. What is that like to come crashing back to reality? Let's start with, how are they living abroad?
So one of the people we feature in the story, her name is Nino Trentinella. She is an art educator. She works a lot of freelance. She makes about $40,000 a year and is able to rent a very nice home. She has a housekeeper. She has childcare. She eats out. She takes taxis everywhere. $40,000 a year here in New York City, you're not able to have all that, especially, you know, with the cost of childcare. Often it's $50,000 alone people are paying for here. So, you know, thinking about giving that sort of life up, that lifestyle where you have so much help. You know, she was, even as someone who was making $40,000 a year in freelance art education, she was able to take 6 months of maternity leave. Someone like that here would not be able to take any leave, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that was one of the biggest things that she talked about, wanting to come back to the US to be closer to family, but she was not ready to give all of that up, basically.
Who would? Yes. As an editor in the business desk, you're steeped in financial ins and outs. What are some of the biggest mistakes people living abroad make financially in failing to plan? I think there's some people in that story who have made mistakes and are trying to course correct.
Right. So one major thing is if you're planning on coming back to the US, if you are earning a salary abroad, you do have to pay taxes, right? So in terms of US taxes, you are able to benefit from something called the foreign income deduction, which basically, if you earn less than $130,000, you can deduct that and you don't have to pay any US taxes on that. But I
read that and I was like, I'm moving.
Yes.
Like, bye.
But the only thing about that is if you're not paying US taxes, you're not paying into Social Security. So if you do move back to the US, you don't have Social Security waiting for you to collect when you're ready to retire. So that's one thing people don't think that far ahead about. You also have to pay the local taxes of whatever city or government you're living in. And sometimes people think like, oh, I'm an American, I just have to pay American taxes, but you do have to pay the local taxes for what you're earning. So it's a lot of long-term thinking that you should be thinking about, but also remember that wherever you're living, you need to be supporting that local economy and local government.
And when you're living in Kuala Lumpur like a king, like who's thinking long term, I think there's a young man in the story who started to realize the precarity of his situation because another big deal is healthcare, right? That's one of the major expenses.
Yes, so a lot of people like to use the socialized healthcare when they leave, but in terms of someone who is uninsured and is just paying out of pocket, and say you're not earning a ton of money, the young man in the story, James Stanley, was making about $15,000 a year living in Mexico City. $15,000 a year is not going to do anything really for you in the U.S. In Mexico City, it's enough for you to live and get by, but also you're not going to be living a big life in Mexico City on $15,000. So you're using that for rent, you're using that for food. And he had some health issues, and he was able to go to some local clinics that are attached to pharmacies and pay, sometimes you pay like $40. But when you have more of a big life-threatening issue, or he got hurt, that is a much larger expense. And even if you are living in a place where healthcare is so much more affordable, if you're not earning enough to pay those costs, then you're gonna have to figure out a way to take care of it. So he eventually had to move back home in with his parents in Chicago. So he's now living with his parents.
So what's interesting to me about that is you can have this cushy middle class, upper middle class lifestyle, but it seems like some of these people had the specter of not being able to keep it up, not being able to care for themselves if things went south.
Exactly.
One of the really interesting parts of this story was the reader response, 1,400 comments, and we're doing a new thing at the Times where we engage with our readers and speak to them. What was some of the most interesting threads that you pulled out through those comments?
I think there are a lot of people who had never considered that they could be living this life outside the U.S. and they're reading these stories about people who've made this change. And I mean, from what I've seen, from what people were saying, a lot of them are already retired and they're living on a limited income once you retire, right? And Americans are living longer than they expected now. So you might have thought you saved enough money for retirement, but you're running out of money. So this is the longevity issue, right?
Whoever thought longevity would be a bad thing, geez.
Exactly. You're living longer, but you need more money to support yourself.
But no dinners out in old age.
And the medium amount of Social Security that New Yorkers get a month is about $2,000 a month. So you have that $2,000. Maybe you have additional money saved in retirement, but you're really thinking about like how am I going to use the $2,000 plus whatever it is to pay for rent, all the costs here. New Yorkers are spending. Some data shows more than $11,000 a year on food alone. Con Ed data shows that you're paying about $115 a month on energy costs. Typically, the Street Easy rent data shows people are spending about $4,000 a month on rent. In Manhattan, it's closer to $5,000. So you're thinking about like you have this limited amount of money. So a lot of readers are thinking, well, why can't I just leave? I'm 70 years old, So a lot of people, even this late in life, are thinking they can do this, and maybe even leave permanently. So.
Is there data yet on this exodus of the unexodus, the return? Have people been looking into this?
There's some organizations that track this. It is a very small amount, I think. Not a lot of people report, but it is probably about less than 10% who are very clear about the fact that they are going to return. Some other people, I don't think they're sure yet. And I think this happens to a lot of people, right? Like you go on vacation, you go to Paris or you go to Malaysia, and then you think like, what if this was just my life, right? Like, what if I just didn't come back from vacation, right?
Exactly, every night before I go to bed.
You're having so much fun, and I think this is sort of the case with American expats. Like, you go off, and you're like, I'm gonna do this for 2-3 years, but then you think like, what if this was my life?
Yeah.
And so
And it sounds like also, what if you can't come back, right? They might be a hoped-for dream, and you're living this
Yes.
lifestyle. And it sounds like, particularly the first woman in the story, the art educator,
Yes.
she hoped to return home one
Yes.
day for her children, and it might be off limits for her because of her savings and her healthcare needs. And
Right, and it's not only the cost. I mean, I think the biggest reason people want to come back is not because they want to have the lifestyle here. It's mostly because of family. They want to be near, they want their children to have their grandparents near them, right? Or they want their children to be in American schools because they want them to be speaking English and maybe go to an American university eventually, and it costs a lot less for college if you live, and get in-state tuition, for example. So I think that, a lot of these people, if they wanted to move back, it was mostly because of family. It was because of education. But given, if they were able to move their family to wherever they were, I don't think they would decide to come back at all.
wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned some very profound numbers that impacting the city, and I used to cover affordability and poverty. The numbers you said already, the young man in Mexico
Yeah.
City, that's already wiped out his salary, and he hasn't even, taken a taxi yet. Mayor Mamdani, a big pillar of his campaign was affordability. Will those sorts of pushes make a dent in this flood of expats? I mean, can the city be reined back in?
Yes, I think rent is the biggest thing for people. 50% or more than 50% of New Yorkers are considered rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. Yes, me too.
Me included.
Right? And then even 1/3 of New Yorkers are spending more than 50%
Wow.
of their income on rent. So, housing is sort of the biggest thing people are thinking about. And in a place like Mexico City, where the average rents are about $900 a month, or in Malaysia, where you're spending less than $500 a month on rent, right? That is like such a big expense that people think about. So if Mayor Mamdani is able to, make housing a lot more affordable, and I know that when you're sort of stressed about your income and you're not making a ton of money, there are different programs in the city, right? Like there are the housing lotteries that people apply to every year, and if you get one of those, like
Yeah.
you're very lucky.
Very narrow. group,
Very narrow, it's very difficult. And if you're able to get something that's more rent stabilized, for example, there's a lot of different ways that you can make life a little bit more affordable for you, but it is very difficult right now because rents have not been increasing in the past couple of years. They've been rising steadily every single year, even though a few of the other costs have dropped a little bit. But I think, yes, rent is the big thing that the mayor should be thinking about.
Well, great. Thank you for this conversation. I feel like our next one will be at our houses in Bali.
Yes.
So thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you.
For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sarah Maslin Nir. If you've enjoyed the conversation and you'd like to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen right now. Thank you for watching.